This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast, a part of the Atheist United Studios Podcast Network. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Please consider rating and reviewing the podcast on the Apple Podcast Store, rate the podcast on Spotify, and subscribe to the podcast wherever you are listening. Thank you to all my patrons. If you too would like to have an ad-free experience of the podcast, become a patron at any level at patreon.com/gracefulatheist. And as a quick note, where we're spending the money, I'm using a tool called Otter AI to get transcripts of our episodes. So now the show notes have transcripts as well. I am trying to backfill those. That's going to take a while to get to all of them, but this is a great way for Google and SEO to pick up the website. Thank you to the patrons for making that happen. The Deconversion Anonymous Facebook group continues to thrive. If you are looking for a safe place to doubt, to question, to deconstruct, and even deconvert, find us at facebook.com/groups/deconversion. Special thanks to Mike T for editing today's show. On to today's show. My guest today is Anne. A content warning that Anne gets into her mental health, including anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation. If you need immediate help, you can call 988 in the United States and get immediate assistance. We also talk about being very pro-therapy. You can reach out to Recovering from Religion if you want to discuss elements of deconstruction and deconversion, as well as reaching out to the Secular Therapy Project to find an ongoing therapist. Anne grew up very serious about her Christianity, took her Christianity even more serious than her parents. She continued to believe that God would participate in her life. She went to YWAM. She chose missionary-style work, even in her secular occupation. She was constantly trying to live up to the standard of Christianity. Things began to break down after she was pregnant, and the pandemic hit, and she was out of context of church. The key line of the entire episode is she says, "And so I persisted." She continued to try to double down to make it work, and yet it did not work out in the end. Here is Anne to tell her story. Anne, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I'm really excited to be able to tell my story, and thank you for this opportunity. I really think it's great what you're doing.
Oh, I very much appreciate it. I really think that this is the magic, is hearing people tell their stories. And Anne, I promise you that there will be people that recognize themselves in your story. So I'm excited to hear it. I understand you've already prepared an answer for this, but you know that our first question is, what was your faith tradition growing up?
Okay, yeah, I tried to think how to summarize this. I guess the very short answer is that from my dad's family, I inherited this fairly conservative kind of evangelical tradition from very young age, going to these very small kind of churches, mainly in city centers, with a strong kind of social gospel type feel.
Yeah.
And I'm fairly sure from kind of limited stories that have been told that it goes back actually to my great-great-grandfather or around there, who was apparently an alcoholic who lived a very kind of deprived life. And apparently he was out in the street and heard a call to repent from the Salvation Army, and kind of immediately dropped to his knees and repented.
Okay.
And that's apparently where this comes from. And since then, everyone that I know in my family has been an extremely kind of committed Christian in that sense. And so his son or grandson, I'm not sure, he was a pastor for the Manchester City Mission during the Second World War. And his son, my granddad, I knew very well, and was always very, very serious about his faith. Kind of have memories of going to his house and he would have like the study guides to each of the books of the Bible
Mm.
lined up in order.
Okay. Yeah.
And yeah, like after church would be like discussing the sermon very seriously, and that kind of thing. So that's where my dad kind of came from, and what was handed down to me.
Okay. And like a question that I like to ask is, did you feel a personal faith? Did you have a sense of this was something that you believed, or that it was just handed to you from your parents?
So I did. Strangely enough, it was only after I deconverted that I really realized that this was a family thing. Like I
Okay.
always had the sense that I had converted.
Okay.
And it goes back to a very young time in my life. And we were going along to a church at a time when there was this, and it sounds so old fashioned and ridiculous that it makes me laugh, but it was this group, this couple um, who traveled around with an accordion and songs with actions for children. And they do these missions. And they came to our church and did this mission where I guess it was like every evening for a week or something.
Okay. Yeah.
And they were all like, children's songs. And then they would do the altar call at the end. And my parents must have given me the option to go or not. And I have a identical twin sister, and she had gone to this last session, and I'd chosen not to. And I was kind of convicted. I must have been about 4 or 5. I was convicted that I she'd gone and responded to this call, and all the parents were talking about the children that had gone up
Yeah.
and gone to the front and said the prayer. And they'd given us these tracts that I carried around with me for my entire childhood. It was inside my NIV Bible
Interesting.
that was falling apart, and this tract had pictures of hell in it.
Okay.
It was really like outlining, like, sin, hell, the prayer that you have to pray. And so that evening, I asked my twin sister, please remember the exact prayer. I want you to do it exactly how they did it, but you do it for me.
Yeah. Okay.
So that was my kind of conversion experience, and I took it very seriously,
It sounds
very
like it.
seriously
Yeah.
from then
Very,
on.
very much.
Yeah.
And then, throughout your childhood and into like the age of reason, was it still like a major part of your life at that point?
It was. So I guess a detail that feels like in retrospect was probably relevant is that conversion experience happened at a time when our family had quite a tragic thing happen,
Mm.
which is, so my parents were very, very young when they had me and my sister. In fact, they were kind of teenagers, and they weren't married, and they got kicked out of the church youth group for it.
Oh,
And
no. Okay.
when they found out it was twins, apparently it turned from being a sin to a gift from the Lord, but everything was fine.
Yes.
But so yeah, so that was kind of the origin story of our family. So they were pretty young, but when me and my sister were about 4, we had a baby sister who only lived for about a month, and then she sadly
Oh,
died.
no.
So we were obviously very young, and too young to be able to appreciate that. But in the work that I've done since, I feel that there was something about the way that I responded to this message about sin in the environment that I was in, and I think I felt it was easy to feel that I was bad
Mm.
because I was surrounded by a lot of very intense kind of emotions associated with obviously extreme grief. And
I see.
so I think I really internalized that.
So, on top of the fact that Christianity kind of tells you that you're bad, that you're a sinner, were you also feeling like because you were around this grief that maybe somehow it was your fault? Is that what you were feeling? Or
I think I felt that I didn't feel it was my fault, but I think I felt that if I invoked bad reactions in people, it made me bad. Or if I had bad
I
feelings,
see.
they were bad. So I often equated feelings of anger with sin, for example. Feeling angry is sinful.
Got it. Okay. So the adults around you are in grief and probably not responding in the most healthy manner. And if you elicited that response, you felt like that was on you in some way.
Yes,
Got it.
yes, I
Okay.
think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think that's something that I thought about in retrospect, but obviously at the time, um, you kind of experience it as a child. You're just kind of absorbing it all.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all very, very real when you're a child. And especially if someone tells you that hell is real and gives you a graphic
Hmm.
depiction of it in a track, it tends to leave a mark on a child. Yeah.
Right, right. Yeah. And for a long time, I really believed that God would judge the soul of my sister, and I would never know if she had gone to hell or heaven, but
Mm,
God would make the right choice.
I see.
And it wasn't till a couple of decades later that a good friend who was also a Christian said, "Well, of course your baby sister's going to heaven." And I
Mhm.
kind of thought, oh. But at the time, like you say, kind of taking it on as a child, it all is kind of internally consistent in some way.
Yeah.
Um, so yes, I guess that probably played into it. And the other aspect of that was that it felt like the church was what we fell into. Like the very few memories I have of that time include, my mum being really, grieving and,
Hmm.
and and weeping in church, and the church ladies coming and taking us away and looking after us. So
Okay.
it felt like they were the safe place where we landed, and so we always saw them that way.
Yeah. And again, I think it's important to recognize the human need for community. And it sounds like the church responded in a time of need for your family in that aspect.
I think so. Yeah, yeah, and our family also always the I saw my parents always having a very kind of generous and fun-loving way of looking out and to the world. And my mum tells stories that when we were babies, if Jehovah's Witnesses came to the door, she'd say, "Take a baby, take a bottle, and you can sit here and talk to me while you feed a baby," kind of thing.
Yeah.
and then she'd give them the number of, oh, I have a good friend who left the Jehovah's Witnesses and now is a Christian. If you ever want to leave, you can take their number, kind of thing. and
Yeah.
and we had all those kind of people in our church who had all sorts of backgrounds. And we even had in one very deprived place that we went to church, we had kids turn up without their parent, and my parents kind of took them under their wing, and turned out I had a lot of social problems,
Yeah.
and we kept in touch with that family. And I even visited one of them in prison with my parents, because there was that level of um, social issues, and my parents kept in touch with them, and kind of, yeah, they saw, you could tell there was that kind of mission orientation, that appealed to them.
Well, and I think you encapsulated it with the social gospel concept for some of the evangelical listeners. There are versions of Christianity that are more focused on feeding the poor, housing the houseless, and visiting the prisoners, that kind of thing. And so there
Mm.
are some people who actually do try to do what Jesus literally talked about. And it sounds like that's
Yeah,
the environment that you grew up in.
yeah, yeah, certainly to start with, at least. Yeah.
Okay.
So we were involved in a lot of different organizations. We used to go on like Christian family holidays where we'd stay in big old house with other Christian families, and there
Okay.
was tons of things like that. And I really had the sense that we were always in these small churches, so they always used to welcome us, because like my mum would be happy to do the Sunday school, and we would join the Sunday school, and they'd ask us to play Mary in the nativity or whatever. Um, and so I thought we were that Christian family, and it was all good. And then my parents got divorced,
Oh,
and very quickly remarried. And I was 12 at the time,
okay.
and it was like a really devastating shock to me.
Mm,
Like it really, I felt like I'd been betrayed because I had these very strong convictions. Like at that age, it was very black and white for me.
yeah.
Um, and so the other thing was that because my mum didn't come from a Christian family, she had kind of converted around the time that she met my dad. And because my grandparents on my dad's side were very kind of devout and very kind of serious, um, I think, well, that was the way it was explained to me anyway. They decided that the story would be that my mum had left, and she basically left and just kind of abandoned the whole Christian life at the same time.
Mm, okay.
Um, so she did everything that she didn't do when she was 19 and pregnant and a Christian.
Okay, I see. Okay. Yeah.
Well, maybe not everything, but to me, it seemed
Yeah.
like wild living.
Yeah. And that's honestly though a common thing, right? People who lost some of their teenage time or young adult time
Mm,
to the restrictions within Christianity, they come out the other side and they go a little bit wild and maybe not make
yeah,
the wisest of choices.
yeah, yeah. Um, and so we went with her, and we were, some distance away from my dad. But really, it made me double down in my faith.
Okay.
And so me and my sister at that point, we were living in a different town. We were actually near my mum's family, but none of them were religious at all. And we kind of independently like went church hopping, found a church, and would go along every week on
Okay.
our own.
Wow, you guys were really dedicated. Yeah.
We were, yeah, and yeah, we didn't have any kind of mentor or any kind of like connection. And honestly, I think it made me feel quite disconnected because it was very weird attending this very family church without your parents.
Okay.
And people, I almost felt like people didn't quite know how to treat us, like what we were doing there. And we were kind of quiet, and
Yeah.
nobody asked and nobody said anything, kind of
Right.
thing.
Right.
But we just went along every week, and we would walk there because obviously we couldn't drive.
Yes. Yeah.
So yeah, we'd walk down the hill every morning, and then like walk back up again. And we didn't really have a lot of Christian friends because in England at that time, as you will know, like the kind of state religion, I suppose, the Church of England was extremely loosely kind of held on to by most people. So they might be christened as a baby and they might get married in church. That might be very common. But other than that, most people, they might call themselves Christian, but that's really kind of it.
More of a cultural moniker rather than a internal thing.
Yes, yeah. And we certainly would see them as in need of being saved, like absolutely kind of thing. So, yeah, so we felt like I grew up feeling kind of isolated in that way because it was rare that I would have friends that would understand at all
Right.
our kind of evangelical background. Um, so yeah, me and my sister went on this kind of journey, and we ended up. That was the first time that I was exposed to charismatic Christianity. Actually, um, we went to this Methodist kind of uh, this Methodist church. We'd hopped all around. We'd been to Baptists, Anglicans, in the past. Um, after these kind of small evangelical churches, but we ended up in this Methodist church just because it was in walkable distance, and they took us along occasionally to this very charismatic church. And I don't actually know what denomination it was, but it was the first time I really experienced it. And I think the first time I experienced it, I just felt like I felt scared,
Mm.
but I interpreted it as a sign that then maybe that's because this is something that it's almost like I felt scared, therefore it's something that I should do, because maybe like
Okay.
the maybe like the devil would make you scared,
I
right?
see.
And
Yeah.
maybe this is like, so this is maybe something that like maybe this is more spiritual, more, and I was all about anything that would lead me to be more spiritual, more kind of closer to God, more whatever. Um, and we moved a lot growing up, so that's kind of one reason why this story hops around a lot. I went to kind of 8 different schools, and
Oh, wow. Okay.
yeah, I've moved about 30 times in my life altogether. So it's, yeah,
Wow.
then that was kind of throughout. Yeah, yeah. So anyway, we ended up moving somewhere in the south of England, which traditionally has a lot more kind of evangelical Christians.
Okay.
And we ended up getting hooked in the new school with like a little group of people who were quite kind of on fire with the very kind of eclectic backgrounds.
Okay.
Um, and that we were kind of tangentially connected to Soul Survivor, which runs a big festival that's quite well known in the UK, but also has a fairly small church in Watford. And they are very charismatic, kind of, I think, connected to the kind of Toronto blessing movement
Got
through kind
it.
of several
Yes.
generations. I, in name Anglican, but somebody went to Toronto and then somebody came back, and there was this kind of like movement within that little group.
In those kind of early days, especially after the Toronto blessing, a lot of churches that or denominations that you wouldn't expect took on some charismatic elements, probably because of that. And if you start to trace all the lines of the church history, and you can tie things back to events like that. Like you say, a pastor goes and experiences something like that and wants to bring it back to their church, even if their denomination isn't known for that.
Right. Yes. Yeah, and I know that my parents were influenced by Billy Graham as well. So that was another thing that came over from the States.
Yes.
So there
Yeah.
was these, even though we were in these little, very like English places, there was influence from
Right.
these different movements. So yeah, I ended up going to one of the festivals in the summer, and I think I just was very like tortured teenager, wanting to not miss out on anything, wanting to be so kind of close to God. And I was still quite scared of these charismatic kind of things going on. But I think I tried so hard. I was so intent that I had this kind of experience where I felt this new sense of being in this kind of spiritual realm and being close to God. And so that was kind of another chapter in the life of kind of
Okay. Yeah.
um, and it's funny because when I look back when I was much younger, I would read these books that my parents had on the shelves that were from, I think, 70s, 60s, maybe even earlier, the kind of missionary books. So there was, well, that's how I think of them. There was The Cross and the Switchblade,
Yeah. Okay.
um, the kind of David Wilkinson, I think. And then there was Brother Andrew, who like smuggled Bibles into behind the Iron Curtain, I think.
Right.
And there were all sorts of miraculous stories in those books. So although my family did not really have those charismatic beliefs, or that wasn't happening in church, I had it in my mind, the kind of miraculous.
Sure.
And so I did definitely at that from that point really kind of started to believe in God speaking directly to me and things. But I didn't have any, looking back, I didn't have, like I said, I didn't have like a mentor. My dad wouldn't have held those kind of beliefs. My grandparents certainly didn't. And so it was quite internalized.
Yeah.
And I think that when I look back, I think a lot of it was magical, a lot of magical thinking. Yeah, and I
Sure, with
really,
hindsight,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And I really wanted it to be true.
I think you've hit on something that's really important, that if the children can take on something much more seriously than even the parents do. And so it sounds like, and not to question their faith in any way, but like you were taking it another step forward, right? Another step deeper, as it were, of more
Absolutely.
truth, more reality in your life. And even though that wasn't your parents' experience, this was becoming yours. And I think that's relatively common as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I definitely see that. Yeah, in many ways, I really felt I had feelings of resentment towards my mum for leaving because I saw her as a rebel. I remember her telling me at one point that she had thrown away the Bible because it was like it was shouting at her from the shelf.
Hmm.
And to me, that was a sign of, maybe there was something demonic going on.
Right.
That
Okay.
was how I interpreted
Yes. Got it. Understood.
it. Which obviously now I don't think, but it made me wall off and protect my faith and feel that I had to um, double down.
Okay. Roughly how old are you at this point?
So I was having these kind of experiences at Soul Survivor and things around 17, 18.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. So we're coming up to kind of finishing school and deciding what to do next. And I'm very much feeling like God speaks directly, and this crazy thing happens, which is that I am a chaotic, messy teenager, and I happen to have a leaflet about a YWAM,
Mm,
Youth with a Mission,
yes.
discipleship training school, lying on my bedroom floor. And I am applying to universities to get into vet school, which is very competitive, and I'm getting these rejections. And I'm thinking, what am I going to do? I'm planning to reapply next year if I don't get in. And it's all kind of stressful. And then one day I just kind of look down and see this leaflet. And of course, it's a direct like word from
It's
God.
a message from
And
God.
it's a
Yes.
message from God. And all I've wanted is to be a missionary on an adventure. It's like all I wanted, like these stories in these books. And
Yeah.
so I was like, great, that's it. That's exactly what I'm going to do. So I did get into vet school, but I actually postponed for a year because my heart had already like totally fallen for the idea of going and training to be a missionary. So I postponed for a year and I went there. And it was a weird year a little bit because, well, firstly, I went to Scotland, and I went to Scotland because that's where the leaflet was advertising. But I learned afterwards that Youth with a Mission is really global, and I could have gone to Hawaii or
Yeah.
India or anywhere in the world, but I went to Scotland, which is,
Okay. It's a long way to go, really. Yeah.
yes, yeah. And it also happened to be just a couple of weeks after 9/11 happened as well.
Oh, okay. All right.
And of course, a lot of Americans went. There were a lot of Americans who wanted to go and discover their Scottish roots and travel to Scotland. And, it was an adventure for them. But of course, when we arrived, there was a lot of like, nobody knew exactly what was happening with air travel and things. So we ended up doing our mission that originally could have been anywhere in the world. We ended up doing that in Scotland as well.
Okay. I see.
So there was a couple of months of training, which was like these lectures and a lot of kind of prayer sessions, very charismatic, a lot of pressure to speak in tongues, a lot
Mhm.
of like looking for the miraculous, and really like people making projections about kind of about suddenly seeing the whole town like saved and things like that. And I was just very like taking it very seriously. Um, and it just so happened that there was this American guy there who looked kind of like, um, I'm going to put this in retrospect. He looked kind of like good looking American Jesus. Like he had the long hair and he had the bright blue eyes. Um,
White Jesus. Gotcha. Yeah.
yes, he
Yeah.
was he
Yeah.
was white Jesus.
Yes.
And of course, like my dreams were like fulfilled because
Yeah.
all I wanted was this like Christian man and like this missionary life. And so um, one thing led to another, and we ended up getting married like very, very young.
Okay.
Um, Same as my parents, really, and really against the will of my parents. My parents were
Uh,
very strongly against it. And we also did not have uh, very much money, or like everything was very much kind of in the moment. And so the way it worked was that we basically were in a long distance relationship for a year, and then he hopped on a plane and we moved into a single room basement in the middle of London.
okay. I imagine that was a shock. Yeah. Yes.
Neither of us had any previous relationship experience,
Yeah.
no support from my parents. His parents were a long way away and thought that he needed to become a man and be responsible now. Um, and that was yeah. So that was kind of, and I had this like vision that we were going to be this kind of missionary family and we were going to travel all over the world. And in fact, I really wanted to live in that location in London because it was very socially deprived.
Okay.
And I had been going during my first year of university when we'd been in this long distance relationship. I'd got involved in this really inner city church that had this big Salvation Army mission where they fed homeless people and like treated drug addicts and homeless people in the basement. And that was really like, I was really drawn to that. And I really wanted so much to kind of, for God to use me. Um, and so we ended up doing that. I ended up volunteering us in the first year to get involved in a summer mission. Like on top of my veterinary school, we were involved in this summer mission, which I decided that God was leading us to plan, which involved hosting young people to go door to door, which we did. And then on top of that, the same summer, I also planned and found funding for a trip to Central Asia to go and explore being missionaries. So I was kind of like
Wow. All over
a
the board.
little
Yeah.
over a little overachieving.
Yes.
Um,
Yes. Exactly.
yeah, and this is where the I think the first real cognitive dissonance really came in,
Okay.
because in reality, my husband had already begun the process of deconstruction,
Okay.
and I was completely unable to see it or recognize it. Because I did not want to see it. But also, he didn't believe that God spoke in that way. And again, I couldn't see it because I didn't want to. And so every time we'd have like this feeling, I had this feeling like I was forcing these things. And it didn't feel spiritual. It didn't feel like God was answering. It didn't feel like there was no fruit that I expected from this level of commitment. Like I'd gone against my parents. I had taken this risk. I knew nobody who'd got married at that age because, like I said, there wasn't a normal part of my culture. So none of my friends, it was a crazy thing to do
Okay.
to my friends, I think. So we didn't have any network in that sense of other married couples. And on top of that, there was a lot of, I guess the word is psychological distress, I
Mm.
think, because we were dealing with adjusting to a huge life transition. And for my partner, it was the first time living in the country, first time living in an inner city. It was the first time managing a budget, really. And we were in this very enclosed space. And like I said, no prior relationship experience at all. Um, and so I think, there was a lot, looking back again, I think there was a lot of like clinical anxiety and depression. And um, neither of these us even had the thought to reach out for help, because I don't
Right.
think we didn't even kind of categorize it as a medical problem. Like to me, everything was a spiritual problem. a spiritual fight. And so, yeah, it's kind of shocking to me looking back now. I recognize a lot of distress. And I remember us going to a Christian conference, and we were surrounded by other students. And I remember coming to in the morning, really having suicidal thoughts.
Mm.
But I didn't even really recognize it. I just thought, oh, that's strange. But I think psychologically, I was looking for an escape because it felt, um, I think the cognitive dissonance of being in this, like, we were, like I said, at a Christian conference, we were signing up to everything Christian, and yet nothing felt like I was getting any feedback from anywhere, that anything good was coming out of it.
You know, I do think that this is important as well, is that the most faithful, the people who take it the most seriously, suffer from it the most because God made these promises and you believe that God is going to come through and going to be there for you and participate in the ministry that you feel called to. And then nothing happens, or reality, just normal reality hits, and it's
Hmm.
this deafening silence, and that can be really traumatizing and difficult to get through.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I didn't have everything was like I said, a spiritual fight. So
Mm.
in some ways, when I felt bad, I felt like, well, maybe this is a test from God, and that it's going to come later down the line. There's the fruit. And so it made me double down rather than thinking something's wrong. It's
Exactly.
like
Yeah.
a sign that I need to do more.
Yeah.
Um, and so I persisted.
Yes.
And I persisted in spite of um, like a lot of negative feedback that like this reality was not going to emerge. And I tried to make things happen a lot. Um, and I uh, thankfully both of us graduated from university, which I'm really grateful that I'm feel incredibly grateful listening to other people's stories that I was have had access to a lot of education that has been very much secular. But what I did is that every chance I got to make my career closer to being a missionary, I took that option.
Right. Okay.
So I went back after, yeah, after being a vet for a couple of years, I went back to university to study epidemiology, with this idea that like, if I can't go and initially I was like, I'll go and be a vet overseas, and I'll use my veterinary training to um, bring good news to like
Yeah.
livestock farmers. Um, and when I just wasn't getting the kind of enthusiasm from my partner. And so I went back and trained to do epidemiology, thinking that, if I can't go and be a vet, maybe I can do some kind of public health research that will allow me to travel. And I actually did that. I ended up doing a PhD, which involved me doing field work in Central Asia.
Okay. Okay.
And I also traveled quite a bit during that time. Again, I was very lucky. And everywhere I went, I would go and find the church. And in places where it wasn't, they didn't have, where it wasn't acceptable to be overtly evangelical, I would use my contact networks to find the unadvertised church,
Right.
and I would go. So I went to those churches in like China, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, India. I went to a lot, and I also felt like maybe I was being a missionary. Like I carry a Bible, and I remember I left a Bible somewhere in like an apartment that I rented and things like that. But again, it felt like I was making it happen, and like
Right.
doors weren't opening, and I still wasn't getting the enthusiasm from home, and things are still difficult. And then I ended up, after I finished my PhD, I ended up accepting a job as a postdoc researcher in the States.
Okay.
Um, and so we moved. I dragged my reluctant partner back to the States and promised he was only committing to a year.
Okay. Yeah.
Within the year I was pregnant, and and kind of the rest is history.
Yes, exactly.
But I do think that was an important part in my deconversion because it removed me away from everything I knew and the Christianity that I knew. And by that stage, by the way, we just kept taking these steps to more less charismatic and more liberal Christianity
Okay.
and churches,
Mhm.
mainly to keep my partner happy, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
But increasingly, I felt that sick feeling, like the sick feeling that something made me feel uncomfortable, but I never would have labeled it. But I remember the day when a friend shared something on Facebook about how women should be really equal to men. And I remember kind of thinking, yeah, do you know what? I actually think that.
Yeah.
And I had insisted as a 19-year-old that I wanted the old-fashioned vows where I promised to obey because I
Okay.
took
Yeah.
everything very seriously.
Yes. Yeah.
So there was a move to more liberal
Sure.
things. And trying to accommodate and find like what would work and what felt right. And then when we came to the States, we tried to find a church that felt right. And a lot of it was because my partner was really falling away and really not wanting, just had no enthusiasm to go to church at
Yeah.
all. And some of it was health related, like he could find excuses, but really he just didn't. And so I was often going on my own.
Okay.
And it felt very foreign, which was a really weird feeling because church had always felt like the place where I understood the language and I understood the culture.
Yeah.
And then just going to a church in America, I felt like I don't. I feel uncomfortable. And I experienced situations where I felt like people were superficially trying to like bring me into the church.
Yeah.
And that felt really uncomfortable because like I was the one who was like the most saved
Yeah.
of everyone.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
like and yet I felt like this outsider and it all felt very like superficial and I noticed it was like I was noticing that it had a lot to do with money. And also obviously I was going for a time with a very young baby and I was realizing that when you're there with a baby on your own, it's limited how much you can really interact during a service. You're just
Yeah.
trying to keep a baby happy for the whole service.
Sure.
And then you're exhausted and not able to do much for, well, certainly for me, for the rest of the week either. So then it was like my role changed, and I felt like I was the one in need, and yet whenever I asked for help, I felt like that was just a way for them to get me in.
And I can feel what you're describing. Like, so there's several things happening at the same time. Just what you described, obviously being a mother with a baby is one element, but coming to the United States had to have been a culture shock. Like you say, the language of the
Sure.
church was different. But even more than that, like you're beginning to have that cognitive dissonance and that need to church hop or to find something that feels right. And then it just
Mm-hmm.
doesn't is so painful. It hurts so bad. And like, that is really common. I hear that all the time. I know that I've experienced that myself as well, that you're looking for the thing that you know should exist and you can't
Mm-hmm.
find it. And then on top of all of that, like you're describing, you've been the giver, and here you find yourself in a place where you need and recognizing the superficial nature of the response. So, man, I can feel
Mm-hmm.
for you. That was a rough spot to be in.
Yeah, yeah, it was. And then the pandemic came.
Mm.
Um,
Wow. Okay.
yeah. Yeah, actually, before the pandemic came, I really hit a low spot mentally with the small baby. I was on a work visa, and so I had no option but to carry on working. Um, and I come from a culture where it's normal to take a year off after you have a baby, but this was the
Right.
kind of 6 week deal, and not much support around, and um, trying to match up like where is God's plan or purpose in all of this? It just feels so far removed from what I was trying to get to. And I've tried so hard to stay on course.
Yeah.
And so I started experiencing like signs of overt clinical depression at that point, and I
Okay.
had access. Yeah, I had access to free clinical psychotherapy, which again, so grateful for through my job. And so I was able to go along, and that was huge for me because she did not. It was just very skilled, very professional, really good therapy. Um, and she didn't touch the religion thing because I remember her asking, what does it mean to you? And my response was, it's everything.
Yeah.
It's everything. And I remember her asking, you've had kind of a difficult time. But you're kind of resilient. What are your resilience factors? And I said, Jesus and my twin sister.
Mm.
So
Interesting.
like
Interesting.
she didn't press that further, but she just simply like did the whatever the kind of psychotherapy kind of tools and listening and things like that. And I started to feel like a lot of it was to do with internalizing things.
Hmm.
And I remember having a moment when I felt like when I was praying, what I was actually doing was like working my way out of my bad feelings.
Okay.
And I started to feel like that's the opposite of what my therapist is trying to get me to do. And like felt like praying was like escaping to a magical place where you felt like
Yeah.
things was going to get better. And that's the opposite of how to heal myself.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I kind of, without even thinking about it, I just kind of thought, I've got to stop doing that for a bit. I need to actually be present and work through what's actually going on. And I think that was the step. And there was no thought of leaving Christianity or anything. I just um, felt like I was just following my intuition purely, I think. And then the pandemic hit.
Okay. First, let me just say how insightful that was and self aware to recognize that to begin with is really quite impressive, honestly. And I know there's the pandemic probably makes things much worse, but just acknowledging that it is a bit of fantasy, it is a bit of magical thinking, prayer is, and then
Mhm.
to the need to remain in reality and deal with the emotions that you're experiencing or the depression or what have you is
Mm,
really quite insightful.
thank you. I appreciate that. Um, and it took me a long, long time to get there. I mean, we're talking about like 30 years after conversion.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So, and I honestly think that one of the reasons I was able to get to that place because I was so far removed from my place of origin. And I also think that it was because my therapist created a kind of safe place. Like I felt some level of safety, of emotional safety, that allowed me to do that. But I remained, as far as I was concerned, a Christian.
Yeah.
And I never had conversations with my partner about him deconverting, even though he kind of, well, I don't know if he would say deconverting so much as deconstructing,
Okay.
but he, I think he knew that I couldn't deal with it.
Mhm.
And I subconsciously knew that I couldn't deal with it either. And he was incredibly um, gracious in that respect, that he did not push me and he was able to kind of contain it himself.
Okay.
Um, and then basically, anyone who's kind of been through the academic system will know that as a postdoc, you're always on temporary funding. You kind of you don't really have job security. And so with the small child and the pandemic, we also needed to find a job.
Yes.
And I'd been kind of like looking low key, but it all kind of came to a head um, when I had this offer in the Midwest of a permanent job as an assistant professor that would be the way for us to finally have this kind of stability and security. And so we came here, and so bizarrely, we've come to this place that is just surrounded by these huge churches, and they
Yeah.
literally put messages in my mailbox, and it's so strange. And and I hear people talking about church when I'm like in a restaurant or something, which is
Yeah.
so bizarre to me. And I can almost like I can spot them. I'm like, oh, they're Christians.
Yes.
I can see the way they're smiling. I can tell by the t-shirts.
Yes. Yeah.
And instinctively, I had this like, ugh, reaction to the mega churches and the big churches. I just could not stomach it. And I tried Zoom church for a little while for like Anglican church, but I just felt like, what's the point of trying to do Zoom church with a small child? And
Yeah.
just felt pointless. And then one day I had this distinct memory. I have this distinct memory. I was just on my laptop, just kind of, I guess, doing that kind of Googling Zoom, not Zoom, Facebook, whatever thing. And I just kind of, it's almost like this pressure had been building and building and building. And finally it broke through. And I just thought, what if it's not real?
Wow.
And I had not allowed myself to ask that question. I was too scared. Like, I know when people had questioned theology earlier on, I'd felt that kind of sick feeling like I can't go there. It's too, the idea of like there being no hell had been so disorientated. I just feel this kind of dizzy feeling.
Yeah.
But at that moment, I just felt like, oh, that's a question.
Yes.
And I immediately, you know, how just immediately Googling these like words. I didn't have the word deconversion or
Sure.
deconstruction or anything. I just started Googling and I came across, oh, should have written down her name. But she's well known in this community, and has kind of written a book called Leaving the Fault.
Yes. Marlene Winnell.
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah. I came across her YouTube video of her story of how she kind of deconverted. And it was almost like as soon as I asked the question, I knew the answer. It happened that fast.
Yeah.
Um, and so, yeah, I just did lots of research, but I had this, it was total kind of like on the road to Damascus experience. I felt like, all of a sudden I could see I could see the real world. I could see everything. And like, the weight is just kind of gone. I was like free. I was just could discover just kind of living without the weight of what is God telling me? What should I be doing it? And I think that was the main thing for me, a feeling like I was not on this spiritual track, but I so wanted to be.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that was really like the main thing that happened, but that opened the gateway to like a lot of discussions, so that have been very in a way kind of as life-changing, in terms of it's allowed us to discuss the reasons why we got married and why certain things have been so hard, and allowed us to discuss, well, do we want to stay married? Like, and in a way that just was not possible.
You're being honest with each other.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I also I think I also discovered that I am not, I had always just assumed that I was this very normal, straight Christian. And now I'm kind of more feeling like I'm probably bisexual, and doesn't have like, that doesn't necessarily change a lot, but it's like something that I was, for all these years, I never even asked the question.
Right.
Because it was not even, I thought that was allowed.
Right. Right. You can't even think that thought.
Right. Yeah. And so that feels like it feels like there could be more to come down the road. Like it still feels quite early, and it's kind of two, maybe it's coming up to 2 years. Um, but it feels like there's kind of these kind of surges of like um, realizing that I'm freer than I felt like I was for so long.
It's almost being introduced to yourself, right? You get to suddenly
Yeah.
be authentically yourself, whatever that may be. And the discovery
Yeah.
process of taking off the layers of kind of mental protection that you have been carrying around up until that point. I always say it's terrifying and absolutely wonderful that
Yes.
that this discovery process that it sounds like you're still kind of in the middle of. So
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I feel like the hardest thing to undo is this feeling of badness,
mm,
like, and I feel like that might be something that I'm still working on, like in therapy and just in the way that I'm processing and trying to kind of move through this, is trying to separate myself from those beliefs that were introduced so young,
yeah.
and to realize that I don't have to like be trying really, really hard not to be bad all the time.
Yes. What we talk about on the podcast a lot, the idea of secular grace, of humanism for me is about embracing our humanity, and religion takes that away. Not all religion. Most traditional religions take that away. They strip you of your humanity and tell you that you're bad, that you're no good. And like so I think a part of this coming out of it is embracing who you are and accepting yourself for who you are without having to have these external expectations placed on you. And that again can be very freeing and also very scary.
True. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I feel again so lucky that I'm able to access therapy, good therapy here as well. And also that I have a career that's not really um, reliant on my faith,
Right.
um, which allows me to have it allowed me to have a domain of life which wasn't dominated by the church, which I think was healthy for me.
Absolutely. So we are very pro therapy here and often recommend the Secular Therapy Project for people to find therapists. But beyond therapy, what other things have been helpful for you? Any particular books or podcasts other than this one? Information that you found inspiring or useful?
Yeah, I mean, I think I a lot of the things that I've found just by following, your podcast and others has led me to similar things that have been mentioned before. Um, Now, I didn't mention, but in the early days, before I deconstructed, I found Rob Bell really helpful,
Okay. Yeah.
um, as a kind of stepping point.
Yeah.
And also, and he has a podcast and lots of books. Um, Also, let me think. I'm terrible at remembering things. I've actually opened up my um,
That's fine. Take a second to
podcast
find
app
it.
right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I won't mention all the bisexual podcasts that I've been listening to because maybe it's niche, but maybe it's
No, I
not.
don't think
If
it,
you,
I honestly don't think it is. So please
if,
do. Go ahead. Yeah.
oh my gosh, there's a ton of. So there's one called Coming Out with Lauren and Nicole. And a
Okay.
lot of the people they speak to have a religious background. A lot of them don't.
Yeah.
But the ones that do, you really see that intersection between, the oppression from religion and the
Mm,
oppression from society and figuring out who you are. And I just love hearing people's stories. That's one of the things that I love about this podcast.
yeah.
So the Coming Out with Lauren and Nicole is kind of like that, but for um, for queer people.
Fantastic.
Um, Yeah, I love Exvangelical. I love Glennon Doyle's podcast, We Can Do Hard Things, which I put in the kind of category of like self-help a little bit.
Yeah.
And I'm not like I don't believe everything they say, like, I don't think we should make a new religion out of self-help.
Right,
But I
right.
find it, but I also find a lot of humanity in their podcast. I like that.
Yeah.
And yeah, and it feels like that thing of like being in a small group and being able to bare your soul.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, what else? They're my real kind of go-tos, I think.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I can't tell you how much of your story that I related to, like it just a lot of touch points along the way. And you were incredibly eloquent. I could feel what you were feeling. And again, that's the magic. That's what we're trying to get to. I talk about an honesty contest. You came with that honest, authentic part of your story, telling your story. So I just want to thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Oh, well, thank you so much for this opportunity. Yeah, once again, I just think it's great what you're doing, and I think it helps people on so many levels. So thank you.
Final thoughts on the episode. And so I persisted. That is such a great line with a nod to Elizabeth Warren, but captures that desire to double down. I'm going to make this work. I love Anne's honesty. She, as I said there at the end, I could really feel the experiences that she was going through as she told her story. I think you, the listener, are going to have felt that as well. And it is the honesty of telling one story that really is the profound part of this work. There are so many elements of Anne's story that are incredible. Growing up and being more serious about Christianity than her parents, getting married to another YWAMer, the focus on more social gospel, actually reaching out and helping people, picking her careers based on the missionary effect, ultimately going into epidemiology and traveling the world and experiencing other cultures, and then the depression and anxiety that she experienced as she was at the beginnings of the deconstruction process, and her pregnancy and the pandemic, so much happening at the same time. As many other guests have said, the being outside of the context of church, having to have Zoom church or streaming church, begins to allow one to reflect, and Anne did. My favorite part of her post deconversion is the hardest thing to do is the feeling of badness, to separate from beliefs introduced when she was young. And she realized she doesn't have to really try really, really hard not to be bad. She's just a human being, and that's okay. She discovered her bisexuality. She's becoming herself. I want to thank you, Anne, for being on the podcast, and again, for telling your story with rigorous honesty, with passion, and letting us feel what your experience was like. Thank you, Anne, for telling us your story. The Secular Grace thought of the week is You're not broken, you're human. I have a blog post of the same title from the early days of the blog. I'm going to link that here. But Anne's discussion of letting go of the feeling of badness, of the need to constantly be on guard to feel judged. The human experience is difficult. The human experience can be tragic at times. The human experience can be joyful and wonderful. But Christianity in particular, and traditional religions in general, have a tendency to warp that normal human experience and to say that it is because of one's brokenness. It's because of one's unrighteousness. And that message is internalized, particularly for those of you who grew up with a more traditional religious background. And that is very difficult to shake. The core message of the podcast has always been embracing your humanity and the humanity of others. And that includes the human foibles, the NUI, the desire for more, the mistakes, and the human error is all a part of being a human being. And it can be a meaningful part of your life as soon as you're not fighting yourself. You are not broken. You are human. Next week, we have Arlene interviewing Stacy, who goes by Apostasy. I love that moniker still. The week after that is my interview with Jennifer Michael Hecht. And the following week will be the 4-year anniversary of the podcast. So March 14th is officially the anniversary of the podcast. Please join us as we celebrate. We're going to talk about our favorite movies and television programs and books that have elements of deconversion or secular grace in them. And it was a blast to have that conversation. Check that out. Until then, my name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. The beat is called Waves by Mackay Beats. If you want to get in touch with me to be a guest on the show, email me at gracefulatheist@gmail.com. For blog posts, quotes, recommendations, and full episode transcripts, head over to gracefulatheist.com. This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast, a part of the Atheist United Studios podcast network.